Maguses are a series of creatures with the abilities of other powerful and famous cards on them. The series of cards was originally designed as a way to get around the reserved list, a list of cards Wizards has promised to never reprint, though it has slowly crept out of this role over time. Maguses are usually a bit weaker than their original versions thanks to being more easily removed, but have still seen a fair bit of play. Today we're going to go over the best Maguses in all of Magic. And starting us off at number 10, we have Magus of the Will. This is a 3/3 human wizard with a mana cost of 2 and 1 black. It is the ability where you pay 2 and 1 black, tap and exile it, and when you do, for the rest of the turn, you can play cards from your graveyard for the rest of the turn. But any card that would be put into your graveyard for the rest of the turn is exiled instead. This is a take on Yawgmoth's Will, a ridiculously powerful card that usually wins the game when it's cast. All you have to do is just mill a good number of cards, some of which being cards like Dark Ritual and Lion's Eye Diamond, to give you more mana and some cards like Demonic Tutor to find a way to win. And then you can just put together just about any combo you want right then and there. This is a very, very consistent strategy, especially since a lot of the time you'll be recasting combo pieces you already tried to use once before your opponent stopped you. Yawgmoth's Will is a combination of a second chance at your combo and a huge source of card advantage, making it both extremely powerful and a card with a lot of different applications. However, Magus of the Will hasn't quite been as successful. This is mostly because the only format where it's illegal where Yawgmoth's Will isn't Legacy, and it's not quite powerful enough to hold a combo deck together there. The fact that you have to tap Magus of the Will to use its ability is a huge downside that we will actually be discussing quite a bit throughout the course of this video on the other Maguses. Summoning Sickness forces you to wait an entire turn before you can try to recast your graveyard, which is just long enough that your opponent will probably just be able to remove the Magus before it can go off. The power that effect provides would usually be enough to play the card anyway, but Legacy is just too fast of a format to play a 3-mana creature that doesn't do anything when you play it in a combo deck. Considering that all we've done is discuss why this card is bad, you may be asking why it made it onto this list. This is mostly because all of the Maguses suffer from the same issues, the biggest issue being where they're legal. Magus of the Will is only legal in Legacy, Vintage, Commander, and the somewhat newer format, Oathbreaker. The thing is, most of these old reserve list cards are rifling on are legal in all these formats, with the sole exception of Legacy, where they're usually all banned. In Legacy, Summoning Sickness does a good enough job balancing the cards to make them far more than fine for the format. Basically, all the Maguses are potentially very powerful cards that usually just end up being worse versions of the cards they're riffing on. Magus of the Will is one of the best ones that doesn't see much competitive play, though it's not the only one of its kind cracking the top 10. Magus of the Will has a very strong effect that can do a lot of work, it just doesn't have a home. And Wizards is smart enough to not put it into Standard or Pioneer where it could actually do something broken. And at number 9, we have Magus of the Balance. This is a 2/2 human wizard with a mana cost of 1 and 1 white. It is the ability where you can pay 4 and 1 white, tap it, and sacrifice Magus of the Balance to make each player choose a number of lands they control equal to the number of lands controlled by the player who controls the fewest lands, then sacrifices the rest. Then they sacrifice creatures and discard cards the same way. Basically, each player has to get rid of lands, creatures, and cards in hand until they all have the same number as whoever had the fewest of that thing. This is a riff off the card Balance, a sorcery that costs 1 and 1 white and has the same effect. Balance is a very powerful effect, and Magus of the Balance actually has a major upside over Balance. It can be used at instant speed. This is true of a lot of the Maguses, but most of the time it doesn't actually matter. However, the Magus of the Balance being able to use the card as an instant gives it a lot more playability. For example, if it's your only creature, it's basically an instant speed board wipe, and one that forces players to sacrifice their creatures rather than simply destroying them, getting rid of almost all forms of protection. Of course, the best part of Balance as an effect is forcing players to discard cards and get rid of their lands. Balance is often used alongside artifact mana as a way to get rid of your hand quickly, making it so that basically all players will be left with no mana, no cards in hand, and no threats on board except for you, with all of your artifact mana. This has only gotten better when Planeswalkers being introduced to the game who also dodge Balance and can do a lot of work on slowly rebuilding a board state. Now, Magus does sort of run into the same issues as Magus of the Will did. It's not really legal in a format where you can really take advantage of it. However, Balance is actually banned in Commander, unlike Yawgmoth's Will. This means the Magus of the Balance is actually just the best version of this effect in the format. There are several decks that would like to have access to this kind of card, though the primary home for it is in mono-white decks with a focus on lock pieces. In this kind of deck, Magus of the Balance can be a powerful blowout that will set your opponents even further behind after it resolves. The pure power of this effect makes Magus of the Balance worth keeping in mind, even if it isn't currently doing all too much. And at number 8, we have Magus of the Wheel. This is a 3/3 human wizard with a mana cost of 2 and 1 red. It is the ability where you can pay 1 and 1 red, tap it, and sacrifice it to make each player discard their hand and then draw a new hand of 7 cards. This is a riff off the reserved list card Wheel of Fortune, a very powerful sorcery for 3 mana with the same ability. Magus of the Wheel is a suitable replacement for Wheel of Fortune, though not exactly a home run of a card. Summoning Sickness remains a huge downside that stops the card from being half as good as it would normally. It puts the card more on par with wheel effects like Reforge the Soul instead of the original Wheel of Fortune. This card is mostly just outperformed by other, more efficient wheel effects, even in Legacy where Echo of Eons is used far more often. Despite this, Magus of the Wheel is a fairly popular card in Commander. The combination of its low mana cost and easy access means that lots of lower power level tables will have people playing the card over Wheel of Fortune, which is much more difficult to get a hold of. Magus of the Wheel, more so than almost every other Magus, is used almost exclusively as Wizards intended, as a way for people to access the old reserve list cards that can be reprinted. While it's not quite a competitive card, it sees enough play that it needs a mention regardless. And at number 7, we have Magus of the Future. This is a 2/3 human wizard with a mana cost of 2 and 3 blue. It is the effect where you can play the top card of your library revealed, and you can play lands and cast spells from the top of your library. This is a riff off of Future Sight and enchantment with the same abilities. These suite of abilities are incredibly powerful in decks built around it. If you just play a lot of cheap spells, you can cast a ton of cards off of Magus of the Future all in one turn and try to drown your opponent in card advantage. However, the better use of the card is in combo decks, where getting a ton of extra card draw can help you get to your combo faster. While not the most common card for this purpose due to their high mana values, both Magus of the Future and Future Sight do a good job in this role. This is also one of the only Maguses who isn't severely limited by being a creature, as it doesn't have any tap abilities. The turn you play the card, Magus of the Future, is basically identical to Future Sight. The main difference is just card type. Magus of the Future, being a creature, has as many upsides as downsides. The main downside is being easier to remove, as we've mentioned, but it being a creature does have a couple of upsides. The main one is that Magus of the Future can be cheated out with creature cheating effects, which are far more common than ways to cheat out enchantments. Cards like Oath of the Druids can spin into Magus of the Future, and the card advantage it can give you from that point on is so vast that even if it doesn't kill your opponent right there, you can probably win. For this reason, Magus of the Future has very occasionally seen play in vintage Oath of Druid decks as one of the creatures to cheat out. Unfortunately, this niche isn't enough for it to overtake Future Sight in terms of play. Being a creature is a big enough downside that you'd usually just want to play the enchantment version of the effect and have it be more safe. There also wasn't much of a reason to play Magus of the Future over better hits in decks that wanted to cheat out creatures. The card has seen some competitive play, but is completely outpaced by its non-Magus version. And at number 6, we have Magus of the Bazaar. This is a 0/1 human wizard with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It is the ability where you can tap it to draw 2 cards and then discard 3. This is a version of Bazaar Baghdad, a land with the same ability to draw and discard cards. Despite the ability not reading that powerful, Bazaar is a complete powerhouse of a card. It's typically combined with cards that either want to be in your graveyard or be discarded. Cards like Vengevine and Hollow One both see play with Bazaar in Vintage, the most powerful format of Magic, and one of the only 2 formats where Bazaar is legal in. Magus of the Bazaar is very powerful and has seen play in similar decks and formats like Modern where it's legal. However, its play has been somewhat sparing, only because it's typically been usurped by slightly better cards for its job. While they don't move as many cards around in the long run, cards like Faithless Looting before its ban and Cathartic Reunion have typically seen play over Magus of the Bazaar for their ability to do something very similar. They can't do the same thing for quite as long, but these decks, typically Dredge and Hollow One decks, have found that they don't need a Bazaar effect turn after turn. These decks are very aggressive and try to end the game rather quickly, so a card that provides essentially one activation Bazaar that they don't have to wait for are far better than a card that has Summoning Sickness and can be removed before they get any real value off of it. The susceptibility to removal is the ultimate issue with the card, as playing Magus of the Bazaar and having it killed before you can do anything with it is kind of backbreaking. Magus of the Bazaar is a potentially powerful card that's usually just worse than the other options available. And at number 5, we have Magus of the Candelabra. This is a 1/2 human wizard with a mana cost of 1 green. It is the ability where you can pay X and tap it to untap X target lands. This is a spin on Candelabra of Tawnos, an artifact that costs 1 mana and has the same ability. This is a deceptively powerful card. It may seem like a form of color fixing, a way to turn a land of one color into another one by using it to untap a land that taps for the proper color of mana, but players have found a way to make the card far stronger. You see, there are a number of lands that tap for multiple mana, such as Cabal Coffers and Cloudpost, and by using Candelabra to untap them, you can actually generate extra mana for your spells. This has been used by several different decks to power out huge spells far earlier than they should normally be able to cast them. Unfortunately for the Magus, the Candelabra itself is usually just a better choice for the job. Its ability to be cast off of colorless mana, and of course, the fact that it's not affected by Summoning Sickness makes it a lot better in any situation where you'd be using this kind of card. However, there are a few places where Magus of Candelabra can see play over the original. First off, it's actually legal in Modern. meaning it has an entire format where it can see play that Candelabra can't. It's also a lot better in Commander, where you can always just play both cards, where the card has seen a lot more play. This is made even better by the fact that Magus is a lot more tutorable than Candelabra itself, with cards like Green Sun Zenith being able to find it for as little as 2 mana. Unfortunately, there's not really a deck for it in Modern, as the only deck that could really see play in is Urza Tron, and that deck isn't good enough at making colored mana, and once the Tron lands are online, it doesn't necessarily need a mana boost in production. Magus of Candelabra may, one day, have a larger place in Modern, but Wizards is unlikely to introduce more of the cards a deck would need to work in that format. And at number 4, we have Magus of the Scroll. This is a 1/1 human wizard with a mana cost of 1 red. It is the ability where you can pay 3 and tap it to name a card. Then you reveal a random card in your hand. If it's the card you named, you deal 2 damage to any target. This is a version of Cursed Scroll, a 1-mana artifact with the same ability. This is a card that actually has seen some competitive play, as did Cursed Scroll back when it was in Standard. The card was used in a mono red aggro deck in order to shock various low toughness creatures, or more often than not, your opponent's face. Now, while it may seem like this is somewhat inconsistent to pull off, as you have to name a random card in your hand and hope the scroll chooses it, this is easy to work around. You just need to make sure that you only have 1 card in your hand when you activate it, in which case you'll be forced to choose that 1 card in your hand. Since aggro decks usually empty their hands quickly anyway, Magus of the Scroll will often just have the ability to pay 3 and tap it to deal 2 to anything. As good as the card is, it hasn't seen much play outside of Standard. This is mostly because in Modern, decks have access to Grim Lavamancer, who can shock something by paying 1 red, tapping, and exiling 2 cards from your graveyard. Since this card asks for less mana to activate, it's generally much better than Magus of the Scroll is. If Magus of the Scroll ever had another run through Standard, it would have a good chance to see even more play. But until then, it's not going to do much. And at number 3, we have Magus of the Moat. This is a 0/3 human wizard with a mana cost of 2 and 2 white. It is the ability where creatures without flying can't attack. This is a take on Moat, an enchantment with the same ability and mana cost. Moat is a very strong lock piece that can stop a huge amount of damage. Lots of decks just don't have flying creatures, with green being famous for its lack of flyers. If your opponent's deck needs to attack you to win, Moat can completely shut them down. Now, this is a bit inconsistent as there are lots of decks that have more than their fair share of flyers in them, which is why both Moat and a Magus are usually sideboard cards. Magus has mostly seen play as a replacement for Moat itself, though it is generally a much weaker card. In formats like Vintage, Moat does see play in a lot of sideboards, however Magus of the Moat sees far less play, and it's even legal in Modern and sees even less play there. You see, trying to keep your opponent from attacking with a creature can be really risky, as a single removal spell can completely blow you out. Cards like Ensnaring Bridge are just a lot more safe in terms of trying to pull off this kind of strategy. It's arguably worse in Modern than it is in Vintage, since most Modern decks are a lot more prepared for being able to deal with creatures than Vintage decks are, as Vintage is a less board-focused format with more problematic artifacts and enchantments running around. Despite these shortcomings, Magus of the Moat still has one of the strongest effects on any Magus. If it weren't for the fact that Moat simply outperforms it, the card would probably see a lot more play, as Moat itself is still seeing play here and there in Vintage. And at number 2, we have Magus of the Tabernacle. This is a 2/6 human wizard with a mana cost of 3 and 1 white. It is the ability where all creatures gain, at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice this card unless you pay 1. This is a version of the Tabernacle, the Pendrell Veil, which has almost the same exact ability, except it doesn't make people sacrifice, but instead just destroys them. The Tabernacle is just a land with this ability, which makes it a lot more powerful than Magus is, since it doesn't cost any mana to get out and play. However, the Tabernacle of Pendrell Veil is one of the most powerful stacks pieces in the game, so a 4-mana version of it is still potentially really powerful. The card does also suffer the same problem as Magus of the Moat did, which is being a lock piece on a creature, which makes it far easier to remove. However, what makes Magus of the Tabernacle a lot better is the impact it can have on a game as soon as you play it. If your opponent has a good board and you play Magus of the Tabernacle and pass turn, all the triggers will go onto the stack and your opponent will either have to pay the tax or let their creatures die. Even if you remove the Magus afterwards, the single turn of triggers can do a ton to break up your opponent's board. Magus is also legal in Modern, unlike the Tabernacle itself, meaning it has a format where it can see play that the original can't. Despite these upsides, the card just isn't good enough to see much competitive play. It has seen occasional play here and there, but as the game has gotten faster and faster, the card has seen less and less play. This really just goes to show how much of a downside the Magus design is. Either making an effect that was hard to interact with easier to interact with, or adding a larger mana cost to the effect, or in the case of some Maguses, both, and therefore making them far less playable. However, there is one Magus that is good enough to be called a real staple. And at number 1, we have Magus of the Moon. This is a 2/2 human wizard with a mana cost of 2 and 1 red. It is the ability where all non-basic lands are mountains. This is a version of Blood Moon, an enchantment with the same ability and mana cost. Blood Moon is a staple in multiple formats for its ability to completely shut off certain decks with greedy mana bases. If your opponent is reliant on a ton of non-basic lands to make the 4 or 5 colors of mana they need, a single Blood Moon can stop them from even playing the game. Now, you may think that Magus of the Moon, as a creature, will suffer from the same issues as the other Maguses that are stack effects. After all, Magus of the Moon will just be a lot easier to remove than the original Blood Moon, right? This is only slightly true. Since Blood Moon prevents your opponent from casting basically any spells when it's on the field, or at least ideally will, they won't even be able to cast a spell to remove Magus of the Moon. The only thing that really stops Magus of the Moon from being as hard to get rid of as Blood Moon proper is that cards like Lightning Bolt are such staples and can answer Magus of the Moon easily. While it is slightly easier to kill, Magus of the Moon being a creature is sort of an upside, as any creature can attack your opponent and put pressure on their life total. This means that if your opponent isn't prepared, a Magus of the Moon can be even scarier than a Blood Moon is. Magus of the Moon often sees a ton of play alongside Blood Moon in decks that's main strategy is just trying to slam a card like this into play as soon as possible. Having 8 copies of the card in your deck just means you'll be able to open the card even more consistently. Now, Blood Moon is usually preferred over Magus as a sideboard card just because it's slightly more resilient. But Magus of the Moon has seen far and away more play than any other Magus in the game. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, please let us know down in the comments below.